YouTube, Awesome Writer here. Welcome to my series review for Kikai Sentai Zenkaiger, the 45th Anniversary Sentai Series. So if you haven't seen my last few series reviews, I've kind of been structuring these different from the past, where I kind of do a pros and cons with some mixed stuff in between, rather than going over story and characters and individual beats, because it all comes up eventually. And I'm going to be doing something similar here. However, I'm going to bounce around a little bit, so I hope it's not too messy, but I felt that thinking about what I wanted to say for this review, a lot of the pros and cons are kind of two sides of the same coin. You'll see what I mean when I get into the review. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, and if you didn't know, this is obviously an anniversary season, so one of the key things I'm going to be talking about is probably the last segment, is discussing how successful Zenkaiger was, or how good it was as an anniversary season. So let's start with our first pro about the series, in that it could often be a very fun and creative series. Now this is something where your mileage may vary depending on your tastes, but each individual filler episode or arc usually had a lot of fun and creativity put into it in regards to how the monster worked, you know, what their scheme was, how the Rangers would deal with it. There was a lot of really fun and creative stuff that led to a lot of humor and interesting situations, interesting ways to take down the monster. In particular for me, the part I liked most about that was the mecha fights, because, you know, I like a good mecha fight, but after watching Sentai and Power Rangers for so many years, especially within the context of individual series, they can get old fast, especially since after a while, outside of big fights, it's just going through the motions, and to be honest, a lot of the times I'll fast forward through them. This series though, with each monster having a gimmick, almost every Megazord fight had a very unique gimmick to it. More often than not, kind of dumb humor. Again, your mileage may vary. I know it might have annoyed some people, but it was something that kept the mecha fights fresh. Now, this is what I was talking about with the positive and negatives. There is a negative side to that, whereas I feel it got kind of old. I think that was fun, and I think that's the type of series Zenkaiger is supposed to be, and it was very successful at that. And there's a lot of people that really like that type of thing, as mainly the show is just that. So in that regard, it succeeds. But for me, that's not all I want to see, so it sucked that there was just so much of it. And even though I think that they had a very consistent level of creativity, when you have 40 plus episodes of that happening and there's very little plot going on, it can get really old. So even though I would, later in the series, I'd be like, this episode was entertaining, I feel like I've seen it. I'm done with this shtick. You know, I'm kind of tired of it, and I think that it just kind of weared on me after a while, especially as we got to the final arc and I was waiting for things to wrap up and we were still doing dumb filler arcs. So it was kind of like something that could be fun and entertaining, but for me, overstayed its welcome. However, even though there was a lot of filler like that, there was more plot than I thought, and that's another positive, is going into this series, I wasn't sure what to think. You know, a lot of us thought that in regards to how different it looked like it was going to be a silly and wacky series only. In a lot of ways it was that. But with that being said, it had a lot more going on story-wise and character-wise than I thought, and it had a lot more quiet moments where you could actually take things seriously, for lack of a better word. And I was impressed by that, and I think that was kind of nice to include a little bit of that. I think it keeps the audience engaged more when there's more to latch onto than just a dumb fun time for 20 minutes. And I was surprised by how much there actually was, especially at the beginning of the series. Because the series that it most reminded me of was Car Ranger, and I would argue this one has even more beats where they take the story seriously. And I was impressed with that to a degree, because I did not expect it. Now, another case of there being a negative side of this, I feel like because I was expecting no story, then all of a sudden there was story, I was overly impressed. Meaning, I'm still happy that there was story within it outside of the tomfoolery. And I'm sorry, I just said the word tomfoolery. When I got down to it and really reflected on it, the story that was there wasn't that good. It was really generic, and I feel that, not that it made it bad or anything, or that I retroactively hate it, but I retroactively do think that at times I was a little bit too excited about things or invested in reviews when I think I was just, like I said, I was expecting nothing. So when they gave me a little something, I'm like, oh my god, I can't believe they did this, they're actually having plot. But then I thought about it, I'm like, the plot's not that great, and the two cornerstones of the series were two of the most generic plots, which is a generic redemption story and a classic Toku missing parents story. Very little that was innovative about either of those stories. Again, not to say that they were bad. Now, in regards to a positive that doesn't necessarily have a negative flip side, was I did like the sort of more deep cut references they had. I'll kind of get into some thoughts on the anniversary aspects, but this is one anniversary aspect that was probably my favorite, is the references and uses of gears that were more significant and in-depth than just, oh my god, they summoned it! Oh my god, bright colors! It was like a reference to the actual events of the show. Like, one of my favorite parts of the whole series was the Jetman parody, the parody of the dumb ending of Jetman, which was great because you really appreciated that if you had actually seen the show. And there was a handful of those in the series, and a handful of gear changes line up with certain situations in the show. It wouldn't always happen, but I think those were the best kind because it was beyond just a shallow reference, and it was something that was really rewarding for an anniversary series because it was rewarding for people that knew what they were talking about. Also, in regards to a little bit more of a shallow anniversary thing that worked for me, but it was kind of a nice deep cut, was when Stacey first summoned his mecha and they were all in the toy boxes. I thought that was like, it was kind of a shallow thing, but it was kind of a nice little reference to the franchise at large. So those were kind of the main positives I had. Again, I kind of had to mention the negatives there because there was a flip side to each one. But I do have some negatives about the show overall. So let's talk about Stacey. I think Stacey was arguably the best character in the show. Arguably the only character in the show, because I think that was a problem with the show, is that there wasn't a lot of development for the other characters, which we'll get to in a second. But Stacey definitely had the most going on, the most you could invest in. I think it was a decent story. But there was a lot of problems with the pacing. And that started right from when Kaiser debuted, and their debuts were kind of muddled together. I'm not exactly sure why. I know some of this stuff has to do with the toy line. I feel like Kaiser was scheduled to debut when he did because of the toys, but maybe the writers wanted to schedule Stacey to debut because of the story, and they just didn't move him, and they got all mushed together. So Stacey got a very clunky debut, which started things off on the wrong foot in the first place. I wish they could have changed that, because I understand things like Kaiser where it's like, okay, he has to appear now because his toys are coming out. But Stacey's toys were all exclusives, so it didn't matter. But that's a whole other issue. But regardless, Stacey's debut was unfortunately muddled from the beginning. But then after that, I used this phrase a lot in my reviews, but Stacey's storyline was largely treading water because I think they started his redemption arc too early. And I want to say, first of all, if it were me, I would have loved to just seen Stacey be a full-on villain character. I want to see a full-on villain ranger that doesn't turn good. I know people will use certain examples like the Psycho Ranger. I don't count those. Those are like negative image rangers. I'm talking about someone that's like Stacey, where he's cast and treated like a main ranger, but he's a villain start to finish. The closest we've ever gotten is Abare Killer, and I think that was handled much better pacing-wise, because he was largely an antagonist throughout the show, but you gained sympathy for him without them getting too close to the redemption arc till when it actually happened. But I would personally rather see a villain ranger than another generic redemption story. I'm a sucker for redemption stories, but it just made it a bit overdone. Not to mention Stacey's story, though enjoyable within the context of this series, just felt like honestly an amalgam of Toku redemption stories I had already seen. It was like an amalgam of every evil ranger turned good, plus a little bit of Elan from Ghost, plus a little bit of Chase from Drive. So within the context of the series, it was good. There was a lot of good scenes, but it was just like this kind of patchwork of past stories within it. The pacing was off because I think they needed to slow burn his redemption. They got to the point where he would be almost redeemed too soon, resulting in this cycle where he would be almost redeemed and then stop, almost redeemed and then stop. So we just kept doing the same thing. I feel like him and Kaito had the same exact conversation every episode. We would go through this arc and there would be a big moment where he's like, I'm gonna kill you finally, Zenkaigers, and then he'd be like, no, but I want to be good. And then Kaito would be like, do you want to join us? No, I don't want to join you. And then we did that like 15 times. Crapper, get off the pot, dude. I don't even care if you're redeemed anymore. Speaking of pacing for this story, the other main story was Kaito's parents, which was a prevalent thing in the series, and I think with the dad, the Hawkeiser stuff worked and had some really good stuff. I think it was unfortunate we let him go from the show right after that, because I actually really enjoyed his dynamic with the other characters. But then you had the search for the mom, which this is one of those classic Sentai things that I hate in some series, like Zyuohger did this, I think Ninja did it, where you have this stop and start, where they have this big arc, and then when they're not doing it and they're doing filler, it's like never mentioned, so it feels really awkward. It feels almost like it's filmed out of order, or you could just take this chunk of like 10 or 15 episodes and not even watch them and not have missed anything, and I think that was ill-paced too. Not to mention a lot of missed opportunity. I think the search for the mom, and even a bit with the dad, could have given a wealth of different types of stories, even different types of filler episodes. Like that one episode when they were looking around for in the different worlds, could have set up a different mini-story where sometimes, instead of having a monster attack, they might have traveled to a different world. And then they just kind of dropped it, and then at the end of the series, she was just kind of casually found, like, oh, hey, look, we found her. And even though that was the main story, I thought that it was ill-paced and there was missed potential there. Even if they wanted to do more filler, there was missed potential to mix that filler up. As I mentioned when I started this stuff with Stacey about characters, I think that was another weakness of the series. Even though for the most part I didn't mind the characters, like Kaito is that obnoxious Toku protagonist that's like, we gotta be optimistic, guys, full power non-stop. And it's like, are you okay? Like, it doesn't feel like a real person. Like, even though he's that type of character, I will say he did annoy me less than others. And I did like his dynamic with the, let's call them the Jumans for a second, with the Kikanoids. Juran was probably my favorite because he was like Momotaro's light. Even though I did like them, I don't think there was a lot of character development in this series. And there's some people that don't need character progression and they say that it's better or they're fine with just getting backstory. But I feel like outside of the enormous amount of time we spent on talking about Kaito's childhood and connection with his parents, there wasn't a whole lot for the rest of the cast, if I'm being honest. Like, outside of us building the backstory to Kaito's parents' story, I don't feel he grew or changed throughout the series or I learned anything else significant about him. And I think even worse for the other Kikanoids, they barely got anything. I'll give them credit. At the very beginning of the series, I was impressed that they laid down some really nice characterization and groundwork for them in regards to us to getting to know their personalities and why they are the way that they are, and a little bit about their backstories with flashbacks. But then after that beginning arc, they basically just became cartoons that followed Kaito around, and that was something I was worried about when we got this series with this different look. Even setting aside, apprehensions about the design, I was worried that because we didn't have human characters, we would miss out on having a well-rounded cast, and it did just feel like Kaito and his 4 cartoon buddies. And I feel that extended to 2 Kaiser as well. 2 Kaiser, like a lot of 6, got a lot of focus in his first handful of episodes, around 5 or so, but then after that, outside of a couple little focus episodes down the road, he largely became a cartoon. He was basically just a caricature. That's a problem I've had with a lot of Six Rangers in recent years, though, to be fair. And not all of them, this is something I brought up before, and people say, well, it's not all the time, and it's not all of them, but a lot of them in modern Sentai will be that. They'll show up, have a cool story, and then they become a caricature. At least, I'll say the Zox was a little bit cooler. I feel that I don't know why we moved away from Six Rangers being cool and made them dorks, but I think that he did have a bit of coolness to him. I didn't like the dancing at all. I'm going to be honest about that. I think that kind of ruined the coolness for me. I wish he didn't have that. Personally, it's just not my jam, literally. But I did like his personality, at least had a little bit of coolness in him. Like, I really enjoyed at the beginning stuff like that classic plot where the civilians are under a spell and the Rangers are like, we can't hit him. And Kaito's like, Zox, we can't hit him. And he's like, why? He's like, they're under a spell. And he's like, oh. I just thought stuff like that was funny because it kind of went against the trope. Now, I have one last point before I get to the sort of discussion on it as an anniversary season / wrap-up, which is I wanted to address Zenkaiger's uniqueness in regards to their design, because I feel like something should be addressed, because Zenkaiger really was probably the most out-of-left-field different design we got when it was announced, which caused a lot of discussion and worry about how different it would be, and it certainly looked different, and there was a worry that the franchise would change and it wouldn't feel like Sentai. And when all was said and done, to be honest, outside of the aesthetics, you couldn't get a more basic Sentai experience. Like, once you got used to seeing the 4 Robo Rangers and not a traditional Ranger-clad team, the series was not very innovative at all. That's just my opinion. Like I said, they had created plots for the filler, but I think they really missed the boat on having such a unique-looking team and doing something unique with the series. Because outside of the unique look, this was a very basic Sentai experience. In my opinion, there wasn't anything innovative outside of the aesthetics. Now let's talk about this as an anniversary season. Was it successful as an anniversary season? I think it depends on what you're looking for. I think it's very subjective. In a lot of ways, on paper, it did a lot of what I wanted. I didn't want it to be overstuffed with shallow stuff and fan service and cameos and all this crap we've been oversaturated with. So it was more subdued. All the anniversary stuff was primarily the aesthetics, an occasional reference here and there. So on paper, it did a lot of what I wanted, but I think it really missed a good heart for an anniversary series. And I can't bring this up without bringing up Gokaiger, because Gokaiger was a great anniversary series. Of course, it did have the Gokai changes, and it had the cameos, which certainly added to it in significant ways. But what I think personally made Gokaiger a great anniversary series for me was the thematic element of celebrating the legacy of Sentai, because the core storyline of those 5 Rangers, or 6 Rangers, is about going from this group of pirates that didn't care about Sentai and were only looking out for themselves, to embracing the legacy of Sentai and truly becoming the 35th Super Sentai, and like I said, embracing that. And I think that was a great thematic anniversary story for the 35th series. And I think they could have done something similar with Zenkaiger, not copying Gokaiger, but a similar theme, and using the fact that the Zenkaigers do look so different. This was brought up in the Zenkai Red special, which I really liked. I like that special, and I really like that story of them being different than most Sentai in the way they look. They have a White Ranger leader. They were very different. That was kind of a cool story, and quite frankly, I thought that was going to get brought up again later, and I thought Zenkai Red would be brought back for at least an episode, but we only got that one quick change in that Carrot episode. That pretty much sums up Zenkaiger. But that was a cool story, and I think they could have used that as a long-running arc to celebrate the anniversary thematically and celebrate the legacy of Sentai, is have a long-running arc for the whole team, for the Zenkaigers to prove themselves as the 45th Super Sentai, to say, you know what, we might look different, we're just as valid as of a Sentai, and we're going to prove that we're just as valid and heroic as the past Sentai, but we're also going to prove that we're unique, and we're going to put our own unique stamp and legacy on this legacy of Super Sentai. And I think that could have been a brilliant way to celebrate the anniversary thematically, like Gokaiger did, without overstuffing it with shallow fan service. And I think they really missed the boat on that, because I think that was a really cool story point brought up in the Zenkai Red special, and I thought that would have been really cool. I thought about that a lot during the penultimate episode when they got depowered and they said, you know, even though we don't have our powers, the Sentai that came before us would have fought anyway, and we are too. And I was thinking, how impactful would this moment be when the legacy of the Sentai restored their powers if this had been about them proving themselves? And I think without having to copy Gokaiger's Gokai changes and cameos, they could have celebrated the 45th anniversary in a similar manner to Gokaiger, where they celebrated the legacy of Sentai. And I think it's unfortunate they missed the boat on that, especially that kind of ties into my point about them not being as unique as I thought. And I think that would have been a really cool way to celebrate it thematically, because at the end of the day, it was largely just aesthetic. And it was kind of a lackluster Anniversary series. And this is coming from someone that's not as big of a fan of Anniversary series. And like I said, I didn't want Gokai changes or more cameos, but I wanted a little bit more meaning behind it. Especially with Kaito's parents having clearly liked Sentai, I think that love could have been spread around beyond not Navi just giving them facts. But final verdict, I feel like that last half of the video seemed overly negative. I just had a lot of criticisms, disappointments with the series. But with that being said, this honestly isn't a bad show. It can be a fun time. I think it was overall pretty decent for what it was. It really just depends on taste. Like personally, this isn't my cup of tea overall. Kara Major more so represented what Sentai was like when I got into it and reminded me why I liked it, whereas this was filled with a lot of things I don't like about Toku, especially modern Toku, but I also enjoyed myself a lot. You know, there was a lot of fun to be had. I feel like this might be a series that's better to watch at your own pace, because kind of like I mentioned, it was similar to Car Ranger. That was a series I was able to quite enjoy, you know, popping in the DVDs and kind of watching it when I wanted. So sometimes I would feel like watching 4 or 5 episodes, sometimes it would just be one, and I think this is the type of series that's better watched kind of at a leisurely pace when you're in the mood, and you'll enjoy it more. I would say it's got a lot of problems, you know, a lot of missed opportunities, it's very generic in places, but it also had some really fun and creative stuff and could provide you with some fun entertainment, which is what a lot of shows are designed to do. It's just not my personal cup of tea overall. I would give the series a 3 out of 5 though. I think it was decent, even if it's not my cup of tea. You kind of hope in the future, Don Brothers and Forward, they calibrate things a little bit, because it is getting a little bit too silly for me, and it's one of those cases where you think, am I just outgrowing it? And then you revisit old Sentai and you're like, oh no, this used to be better balanced, but we'll have to see. Overall, it was okay. Didn't love it, didn't hate it, but it could be a good time when it wanted to be. But what were your thoughts on Zenkaiger as a show? What were your thoughts on Zenkaiger as an anniversary series? Let me know in the comments as always. Until next time, don't forget, like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell. Seeing notifications for my videos. Dawson Ryder, signing out.